The evening in Dallas, Texas, had settled into a soft half-light that filled the apartment, casting long shadows across the walls. Jackson sat on the couch, his mind still swirling with the strange conversation he'd had with his mother earlier. Her voice had been different this time, firm and resolute, carrying a weight he hadn't heard before. The words she spoke echoed in his head, unshakable and unnerving. He couldn't quite understand why, but something told him that this night would alter the course of everything. The tension between him, Maggie, and James, which had always been there beneath the surface, would now take on a darker edge, weaving itself into a game of control, where the stakes were higher than anything he had ever anticipated. He felt a shiver of unease creep up his spine as he wondered if he was truly ready for what was coming. Could he maintain control over the situation, or would it slip through his fingers? The lines between right and wrong, between friends and enemies, began to blur, and Jackson was left wondering just how much he was willing to sacrifice to claim power in a world that was spiraling beyond his understanding. Jackson stood outside Maggie's apartment, the cool air of Dallas brushing against his skin as he fumbled with the keys in his pocket. It wasn't like him to feel this uneasy, but something about today felt different. The exchange of keys with James earlier that day had been simple enough, a friendly agreement between two close friends. But now, standing at the door of Maggie's apartment, Jackson couldn't shake the sense that he was crossing a threshold. Stepping into unknown territory, he unlocked the door and entered. The apartment was warm and inviting, decorated in soft tones of cream and pale wood, with sunlight streaming through the large windows. Jackson took a slow, deliberate step inside, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He wandered through the living room, taking in the carefully arranged furniture and the neatness of everything. It was calm, almost to perfect. His eyes drifted to Maggie's bedroom door. He could feel something pulling him there. As he approached, the sense of control, the power to decide, settled into his chest. He was used to being the quiet observer, but now he was beginning to realize that this was different. This was no longer about simple games or passing moments of fun. The power he had over this situation was starting to dawn on him, and he was eager to test the limits of it. Maggie greeted him with a playful smirk, as if she knew what he was thinking, yet there was something else in her gaze, something deeper. It made Jackson hesitate for a moment, but the feeling quickly passed, replaced by a sense of purpose. He had come here with a plan, and he was ready to see where it would take him. Something about her attitude triggered something inside him. He needed to take charge, to make her listen. He took a breath, setting aside any lingering doubts, and stepped forward, ready to assert his newfound authority. This was no longer just a casual exchange. This was the start of something far more complex. Jackson sat in the living room, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The atmosphere felt heavier tonight, the tension in the air thick with unspoken words. He glanced at Maggie, who was sitting across from him, her arms crossed, eyes defiant yet curious. The playful games they had once shared now seemed insignificant, a mere prelude to what was unfolding. As the minutes passed, Jackson's desire for control grew. It wasn't enough to simply be part of the game. He wanted to lead it, to set the rules. Slowly, deliberately, he spoke the words, a challenge disguised as a command. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like the right moment. Maggie laughed at first, a soft chuckle escaping her lips, but there was an edge to it. She didn't take him seriously. She thought it was another one of his jokes. But Jackson was persistent. He stood up, his gaze steady, and repeated the demand. His voice was no longer playful. It was commanding, almost unrecognizable from the usual easygoing tone. Maggie hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mix of surprise and skepticism. For a moment, Jackson wondered if she would refuse. But then, her expression softened, and without saying a word, she slowly rose from her seat, stepping into the role he had thrust upon her. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a rush of adrenaline through Jackson's veins. He could feel the power surging within him, a new kind of confidence filling the void that had always been there. Maggie's resistance melted away, and she complied, her voice barely a whisper as she acknowledged him. "Yes, master." The words sent a thrill through Jackson that he had never experienced before. It was no longer just about the game. It was real now. The rules were changing, and Jackson could feel the control slipping further into his hands. But as he reveled in this newfound power, a sense of unease began to settle in. The lines between playful dominance and something darker were blurring, and Jackson started to realize that what had begun as a harmless experiment was now spiraling into dangerous territory. He couldn't stop. The power felt too good, and he was drawn deeper into the game, unaware of the consequences that were starting to unfold with every passing moment. The further they went, the harder it became to turn back. The evening felt unusually heavy, the weight of Jackson's actions pressing down on him. What had begun as an experiment, a game, was now spiraling out of control. The air in the apartment was thick with tension, and Jackson could feel it in his chest, tightening with every passing minute. Maggie, once easygoing and playful, had grown distant. Her laughter no longer held the same warmth. Instead, there was a coldness in her eyes, a look that made Jackson question whether this game had gone too far. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a phase, that everything would return to normal. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. His relationship with Maggie, once filled with comfort and understanding, had begun to fracture. She no longer looked at him the same way. There was a sense of unease between them now, a silent distance that neither could bridge. Then, the phone rang. Jackson's heart sank as he saw his mother's name flash on the screen. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he was ready to face the consequences. He answered. The moment she spoke, he knew everything had unraveled. Her voice, usually calm and nurturing, was now sharp and filled with fury. She had found out about what was happening, how far Jackson had gone, how he was pushing boundaries, and how he was turning a harmless interaction into something darker. Her disappointment hit him harder than any reprimand could. It was the first real sign that everything he had done had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. Maggie, hearing the tension in Jackson's voice, stepped away, her face shadowed with confusion and hurt. The room felt colder now, and Jackson could sense the growing divide between them. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the damage had already been done, and nothing could repair the fragile bond they had once shared. The realization struck him like a wave. His actions had shattered something that could never be fixed. The line between play and reality had blurred, and there was no going back. Jackson stood there, feeling the walls close in on him. He had sought control, but instead, he had lost everything he had valued. The weight of his decisions began to suffocate him, and for the first time, he understood that some games were never meant to be played. Jackson felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him more heavily than ever. What had once felt like a simple shift in the dynamics between him and Maggie had now spiraled into something far more dangerous. The realization hit him in a rush. The game had grown too serious, too real, and it was no longer something he could control. Maggie, who had once laughed off his commands, was now withdrawing from him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. She was no longer the same person he had known. The playful energy between them had dissipated, replaced by something dark and unsettling. It wasn't just the relationship with Maggie that had begun to crumble, it was everything. Jackson could feel his world shifting, like the ground beneath him was giving way. The phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. Her voice, once a source of comfort, now felt like a thunderclap. She had found out everything, every detail, every moment of the game he had created. She was furious, demanding answers, accusing him of pushing things too far, of manipulating Maggie and crossing boundaries that should never have been touched. Jackson's chest tightened with guilt and fear as his mother's words hit him like a freight train. He tried to explain, but the words were hollow, useless. She wasn't listening anymore. She was done. She told him to stop everything, to put an end to the game before it destroyed what was left. But it was already too late. Maggie, overhearing The conversation stood frozen, her face pale with shock. The realization that she had been caught in this web, used as a pawn in Jackson's game, hit her harder than anything else. Her eyes, once filled with trust, now held only disdain. She turned away from him, her body language making it clear that she was done. Jackson stood there, feeling the crushing weight of everything he had lost. His world, which had seemed so secure just days before, was now in ruins. He had tried to control everything, but now the very thing he sought to dominate was slipping from his grasp. His relationships with Maggie, his mother, and even James were all beginning to unravel. The sense of power he had once felt now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a deep, suffocating sense of regret. He had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. Days passed, and the silence between Jackson and Maggie seemed to stretch endlessly. The weight of what had transpired hung in the air like a thick fog. Jackson could feel the change in their relationship, a shift that had been inevitable but still caught him off guard. What had once been a playful dynamic was now something much more fragile, irrevocably altered by the power he had sought to exert over her. Maggie, no longer the carefree person he once knew, had withdrawn into herself, her trust fractured, her eyes now carrying a deeper understanding of the consequences of their actions. Jackson felt the ache of that distance between them, a reminder of how easily things could fall apart when boundaries were ignored. But in the stillness of the aftermath, both of them began to reflect on what had happened. Jackson, for the first time, saw the full weight of his choices. The game, which had seemed like an exploration of power and control, had caused more harm than he had ever anticipated. He had pushed afar, manipulated the dynamics of their friendship, and in doing so, had nearly destroyed the bond they once shared. Maggie's reaction, the withdrawal, the hurt in her eyes, were all painful reminders of how dangerous it had been to blur the lines of trust and respect. Slowly, as the days passed, both of them began to process the consequences. Jackson could no longer deny the reality that his actions had consequences far beyond his control. His mother had intervened, her disappointment ringing louder than any punishment. She had helped him realize that no matter how strong the desire for control, relationships needed respect, communication, and boundaries to thrive. Jackson began to take the first steps toward making amends, understanding that true power lay not in dominance, but in the ability to heal and restore what had been broken. Maggie, too, started to come to terms with what had happened. She recognized the need for boundaries, for mutual understanding, and for space to grow beyond the shadows of the past. Both of them began to rebuild, piece by piece, understanding the delicate balance that had been shattered. They would never return to what they were before, but in the process of mending, they discovered a new, more mature understanding of each other. Their bond, although scarred, had the chance to grow stronger, as long as they were willing to put in the work.